Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here with Securitas Protector, who is a top FC within Pandemic Horde, an alliance known for wearing about as many hats as it has members, being both a new player-friendly group and yet holding a swathe of the North, probably being one of the alliances most well-versed in interhosts warfare as well. What can you tell us about the alliance on a more day-to-day level?
All right, so you're right about that. Horde does hold a lot of, or does wear a lot of hats. Mostly, what we do now uh, is there's sort of been this content drought recently around the entirety of the game, and so what we do on a day-to-day level now is Horde's really been focusing in on like wormhole PvP and whaling and killing workwolves in other regions. That's something that I've really tried to push as well. Other than that, we do pretty much what any alliance does. We live in our space. We kill people who come into it. We crab a lot. My corp at the moment is I'm in Horde Vanguard, which is sort of like the try-hard corporation in Horde, and we're currently in the south having some fun in Quirius and Catch and stuff, and PvPing in a smaller group down there. So that's sort of what Horde does, mostly on a day-to-day level.
How big would you say your fleets normally are?
So do you mean the fleets for Vanguard, or do you mean for Horde entirely?
The fleets that you run as an FC?
Okay, so I also wear a lot of hats. So I FC Horde Stratups. I also FC Vanguard, smaller gang fleets, home defense fleets. I sort of do whatever there is to be done, just because it's FCing is the one thing that I enjoy in this game more than anything else, and it's really why I play. For example, I'm terrible at making ISK, and among the people who know me in Horde, it's a thing where I never have the ISK to fly FC ships and stuff because I just hate doing that. But so more recently, I've taken to FCing a lot of home defense fleets for people who come in and try to kill capitals or something that are ratting, and those will be maybe like 50 to 100 people. I've also FC'd some strat ops against Snuffed and stuff in low sec, and those are a bit bigger. Horde fleets vary pretty dramatically depending on how much they're hyped and what's going on exactly. It's kind of similar to goons in that way, I think, where they can have a potentially really huge fleets, but maybe depending on what it is, it can be a lot smaller. But so in those low sec fights, it can be up to like 200 plus people, although those haven't happened to be quite as big recently. And then when I'm in Vanguard, it's usually like 20 to 25 people tops, and it's a lot sort of tighter on what we have access to and the doctrines that we fly, because it has to be.
So when you're flying in the south, you tend to fly outnumbered then, because 20 and 25 people is relatively small compared to the surrounding entities of Goon Swarm and all of the Quirius people.
Yeah, we've been quite outnumbered down there, and it's been a nice change of pace because I think you can get a little bit lazy as an FC when you're just blobbing people. Although there's that could be fun as well. But down there we live out of an Astra house. We only have a couple of doctrines available to us. We've been fighting sort of like 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, sometimes more outnumbered. We had some recent fights where we were in Feroxes fighting against like Volt Canes, and in it had come in some Nightmares, and Goons were there, and Jackdaws and stuff. And so we had to play really strategically. NC Dot do live nearby in Gehi, so sometimes we'll be friendly with them and get a little bit bigger. But yeah, we've been pretty outnumbered down there.
All right. So how long have you been FCing with Horde?
So I actually only joined Horde proper maybe 4 months ago, but it's been sort of a complicated history. So I used to lead an alliance called Spaceship Samurai, and we've sort of followed Horde around and been really close with Horde, and we were part of PanFam for a long time. And that's been since, gosh, the days that they were in Cloud Ring, if you can remember that, back when Matani ordered, Cloud Ring purged, and I think we were living in W4 or something like that. So it's been a long time, but I wasn't technically in Horde for most of that time. Although my corp did join Horde for a while, Concordia did join Horde for a while, and then we went and formed Spaceship Samurai again. But we sort of have always functioned as a part of Horde. Even when we were our own alliance, we would be on Horde comms and we would fly with Horde. So it's been like, I don't know, a year and a half now that I've been with Horde, if not directly.
Okay, so how long have you been FCing overall then? When did you start?
So I've been playing since I think late 2007, and I started a corp pretty soon after I joined the game, maybe in mid 2008. And I didn't have any FCs. FCs have always been really hard for corps to come by, and I had just started a corp. I had like 3 people in it, so I just had to start doing it myself. And I wasn't any good at it, obviously, but I just started. I think I started with some RD ruptures, and this was back before the changes that made ruptures good. They had like 3 mid slots, and we flew around with like RD ruptures with an MWD, a point, and an LSE in the mids. Like it was very bare bones, and even T1 Logi really didn't exist in the state that they are now. They were really terrible. So we had like these really gimped large shield rep Ospreys and stuff. It was a whole lot of fun. I mean, I think my fleets were like 8 people or something. There's actually videos on YouTube of it, I think. Still, it's really embarrassing. I sound like a 12-year-old. But so I probably started FCing maybe late 2008, 2009, and I've always kind of been in the sort of mid-range fleet size until pretty recently.
What keeps you FCing after all this time then?
So I think it's one of the really unique things about EVE is how challenging FCing is, and you just want to do it right, and you want to get those sweet victories, but they can't be cheap. You know, they have to be hard, or it's not very satisfying. So I think the thing about EVE is that it's just, you know, with the sandbox the way that it is, and the way that there's very few limitations on what you can fly, and the huge variety of ships that there are in the game, most of which are not used on a day-to-day basis. You know, most alliances have a couple doctrines, and they're pretty universal around the game. And I think what really keeps me playing is that if you're really creative, you can come up with doctrines, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I think, when we talk about the doctrine, but you can come up with these doctrines that are not necessarily better, but they're just odd, and just by looking at the doctrine, you don't necessarily know what its capabilities are. And so you can do some pretty interesting things and surprise people, and they'll fight you thinking that they can win when you know that they have no chance of doing so because you've made this fit for this doctrine that's really odd. But I think it's pretty unique that you can do that. And the other thing that I like about it is, you know, there's no limitation on numbers, right? You can have a surprise attack, you know, or someone you can bridge in with suddenly like 250 people. The fight can change instantly from a total rout to a, you know, you're totally defeating the enemy to a total loss very quickly. And it's just very exciting. And I think there's really no other game that offers anything like that. And that's why, even though I sort of consider myself a gamer, I really don't really play that many other games other than EVE. So that's what really keeps me into it.
So could you say that you enjoy FCing as almost a creative outlet?
Yeah, I think you could. I mean, I really like odd fits because I'm not a particularly good FC in the conventional sense of the word. You know, if you want brawling or kiting specifically, there's far better FCs out there, and I've been beaten by probably most of them. What I think I really like to do is to trick people into fighting me in sort of weird doctrines or something where I can make them a little frustrated. You know, and I won't pretend like I'm amazing at it, but that's when it works. It's really enjoyable. So I like it on that level. I'm not necessarily conventionally really the best FC out there, or even close.
So earlier you talked about how Pandemic Horde kind of looks at several different parts of the game, but do you still think it's had an impact on how you FC, at least in the current era?
I'd say it has, because it kind of forces you to deal with as an FC that not everybody will have trained what you want them to train, and not everyone will be flying in the ships you want them to fly, and you still have to find a way to make them useful. So when I led my own corp and my own alliance, like I was pretty strict about, you know, you're going to train this, everyone's going to be able to fly this pretty soon, and so I mean didn't have to deal with that too often. But when you start seeing Horde, I mean, it's so large, you will get usually what you're looking for. But then, you'll have a fleet which is like 50% what you want and 50% people who can't fly what you want. So I'm usually pretty good now about coming up with doctrines with like random little ships that will make them actually useful and not just, you know, throwing them into tackle. So I'll give you an example. IFC these whaling fleets where we take, you know, T3, or I guess they're called attack battlecruisers now. It's be called Tier 3 battlecruisers, but through a wormhole and we kill Rorquals, and we have all these newbies, and actually, you know, in the beginning they weren't really too useful because you have all this tackle already in the form of like 10 sabers, and you know, once they get tackle, having a couple guys in slashers is not that helpful, but I wanted them to be genuinely helpful. So I came up with this really sort of stupid Osprey fit, but I mean, it did work, where they would cap chain each other, and instead of reps, they would have newts, and then we'd have the veteran players in like semis to rep us up. So we'd have like 10 or 15 cap chaining infinite newting Ospreys on each fleet. And it actually ended up working pretty well. Like we would newt out Rorquals pretty quickly. And because they were cap chaining, even with their relatively poor cap skills, they'd never be dry. They could just permanute these Rorquals. So stuff like that you have to kind of take into consideration when you're flying with Horde.
Wow, that's something that's pretty crazy. I'd never have thought of that.
Well, and I didn't think it would work in the beginning either, because we would only have 5, and of course it wouldn't be enough newting. But once we started to get more people joining, and we started to have 15, I mean 15, and I think each Osprey had 2 or 3 medium newts. I mean it adds up pretty quickly, so it was pretty funny to watch.
Yeah, it reminds me of back in the day when the Guardian used to get a bonus to all energy transfer kind of things, and that included newts. So you could fit a Guardian with like 4 or 5 heavy newts.
I think I do remember that.
Yeah. So I guess that's, would you say that your creativity in terms of fitting is your greatest strength as an FC? Or would you say it's your ability to get people to buy into the Doctrine then?
Well, I think it's a bit of a combination of both, because when you first do these really sort of off-the-wall odd doctrines, I mean, people are a little skeptical, and the way that you fly them is not necessarily very intuitive. So I'll give you another example. So back when I was in test, we had this problem. I was in test for a while. This was before I think I joined Horde. This was right after Hero, and we were living in Wicked Creek. We had these guys who kept coming in like nano gangs to our station, and this was back before Citadel, so camping the end dock was a big problem. And I think incidentally, this is one of the things that the Citadel expansion really ruined, was the ability to force people to fight you by camping their undock, which you can't really do anymore. But that's an aside. So I came up with this sort of retarded doctrine, and we had used it a little bit in Hero before to fight PL, and it was like these insta aligning, basically tornadoes that would lock and fire really quickly, and then you would just warp before anything could lock you. And we used it to pretty okay effect, given that we only had 30 people in fleet. During some of the big fights against PL and Hero, we'd warp in and volley some of their T3s and stuff in their Tempest fleet issue fleets. But it was a very different doctrine to fly compared to anything else. You had no logi. If you got bubbled, you died. It was like really sort of a harsh doctrine. But once people bought into it, some of them really liked it. And so that there's a guy in test who still runs them, I think, to this day fairly frequently, and he's pretty well known for his Sagic Thanatos car or something. He's an Aussie guy. And so he still uses that doctrine to this day, and he's probably a lot better at it than I ever was. But I think I would say both. They're both challenging. I like to make new fits, and a lot of times they don't work, or they're not as impressive as they are on paper. And then it's also a bit of a struggle to get people to buy into it. But after you've been doing it for a while, I have sort of a core group of guys I've been flying with for a long time. They're willing to try stuff out for me.
Your guinea pigs, as it were.
Exactly.
So conversely, what would you say your biggest weakness as an FC is?
Anything sort of conventional. So for example, I'm terrible at combat probing. We had this experience the other day when we were in this Ferox fleet with Volt, and I have like these NC guys in comms like yelling at me because I'm doing such a shitty job at combat probing. I'm sort of bad at paying attention to a lot of things at once, but I also have trust issues in terms of, I want to be the anchor, and I want to call targets, and I want to sort of, balance all those things. So, but I'm not very good at it. But, on the flip side, I'm also sort of a control freak. So you can see how that's sort of a bad situation where I'm not very good at it, but also I don't want other people to do it. So that's definitely a weaker side, and it's gotten me into trouble many times when I'm FCing conventional fleets. So I try to put myself in a position where, I win the fight before I get in, because I do know, with doctrine or numbers or whatever, because I do know that that's something that I'm pretty weak at, especially if it's, a rapidly changing fight or somewhere where you have to burn around a lot. If it's something really slow, like a battleship fight or something where I have time to think and do everything, it's usually okay. But if I'm trying to kite or something, it can be I'm not very good at that, or trying to position really rapidly and stuff like that.
Do you ever use other people in order to mitigate your weaknesses? You said about combat probing. Have you ever thought about using someone else to combat probe for you?
So that's gotten easier. So as I'm sure you remember, CCP's changed things recently to where the links are not dependent on your position in the fleet. And sort of in the bad old days, you had to have, and relegate. You could delegate links via this like mechanic but it sort of didn't work terribly well, and it was sort of gimmicky. And so your fleet had to have this sort of more certain structure where, you had to do the fleet warps and stuff. But now I do that a lot more. And if I trust people, it's better. And I've always also had this weakness, incidentally, where I always have to fly, or I like to fly an FC ship that has a point on it, because I never trust people to like get tackle, for example, on an enemy FC or something like that. And so I always feel like I have to do it myself. And of course, putting a tackle on your FC ship usually, impacts the survivability if it's a shield ship, or you don't have a target painter or something if it's an armor ship. So it's not ideal. So it's something I'm struggling with, and I do have some people that I trust to do it a lot more than others. And so yes, I do that, especially with combat probing. That's something I really need to work on, but I'm just so terrible at it.
Okay, so what was the last mistake you made as an FC? What was the last thing you learnt from?
Okay, so probably the most recent mistake that I can think of, and it's not necessarily a catastrophic mistake, but I think it's something that people can learn from in terms of communicating with their fleet, is I've been seeing the Snatch fleet that Init has pioneered pretty recently, and the fights are usually smaller than Init fights. So, we'll be sometimes on top of the enemy fleet and just ready to push, either a Logi or something important off, maybe their FC. And what I'll always forget to do is we'll be on top, we'll be about to push, and I'll forget to tell my fleet to stop scramming the person that we're going to jump off, because of course the scram will not let him follow us in the jump. And then we'll jump, and it'll just look completely ridiculous, because we'll be sitting 100k off, and he'll be perfectly safe exactly where he was before. So, I mean, that's one of the things that it's so easy to forget to do that. And you really have to say it, because if even one person in your 30-man fleet is not paying attention and scrams this guy, it'll go completely wrong. And you really have to make sure that your fleet is on the same page. So, not necessarily the most horrible mistake ever, but it's quite recent, and it's something that sticks in my mind because I do that, unfortunately, all the time.
What's one tip you would give to a newer FC? Perhaps something that you wish someone had told you when you started FCing all the way back in 2008, 2009?
So the game's changed a lot since then, and one of the things that has changed the most is probably the death of the roaming FC. Now, there's still people like Bjorn who will take these huge fleets, and people will fight them just because they want to. And this is something I've talked at length about, and some people disagree with me pretty strongly. But I think one of the weakest things, and I swear I'm getting to my point eventually here, one of the weakest things about the Citadel expansion is sort of the tether mechanic, where an alliance does not have sort of an undock, which is actually a very interesting space to play in as an FC, because what you could do in the past is take your 20-man gang, which was specifically designed, for example, to kite around or to play on this field, and go and shut down someone's undock. Even if they're a large alliance, that kind of forces them to fight you. Right now, you have a situation where you can go in and try to chase off their ratters or whatever, but they don't really have to fight you. There's no real huge incentive for them other than to keep ratting, and they can just do that in other systems and so on. But if they live in a station, they're unable to leave. You're sitting there camping it, and it really makes them want to push you off. So one of the things that you could do is make this sort of tight doctrine, even if it wasn't a high skill doctrine, just something that really fit together well. And you could go on an enemy station and sort of farm people and try to fight the response fleet until it got too large. And you can't really do that anymore. So I would have told FCs in the past to really do that, because it teaches you a lot about the game. It teaches you a lot about range control. It teaches you a lot about like what you can fight, what you can't fight, because you have no idea, unless you have a spy, what is coming out of that station until it comes out, and then you have to fight it like right away. So you have to make some really quick decisions, and I think it's a really good teaching tool. Now what I'd probably say is do sort of something, and this is not available to everyone, but stuff like Kendar does, where you do deployments and you sort of have this limited range of doctrines, and you have to fight alliances on their home turf, and you reinforce posses and stuff while you still can. It might not be in the reach of every newer FC, but that's something good, because it sort of provides an objective to fight over, and I'm all about that. I would say probably the other thing that you can do is try leading home defense fleets. It's not really as satisfying, but that's sort of, we don't have as many options as we used to in the past. Or, whaling fleets are good too, just because I actually fly whaling fleets less for the Rorqual kills and more for fighting the response fleet that shows up. So, and once again, you have no control over what fleet shows up. You have to either fight it or leave your, shiny Rorqual kill. But either way, when you tackle that Rorqual, something's going to happen, right? Either you're going to get a nice kill or you're going to fight someone, and it'll be good either way. So I think that's actually a really good thing for newer FCs. The only problem is it does require like a good amount of numbers in your fleet, which not everyone has access to. But I just think that's so key in EVE PvP is, you know, short-term, in terms of short-term content, FCing is having some sort of objective that you push that objective and something will happen. Now, whether or not it's in your favor, who knows? Whether you win that fight, who knows? But you tackle that work wall, and work walls is really the only thing I can think of that still exists like this. And as I said, it used to be undocks, and now you have work walls. You tackle that work wall, either you will kill that work wall, which is good, and they will lose a bunch of ISK, or you will fight a response fleet, which, you know, is also good, because then you have something to do and you have a challenge and you can win or lose, and it's all dependent on your skill and your doctrine and so on. So I think that would be my advice. And as I said, it unfortunately doesn't apply to everyone, but that's sort of the best that I can think of.
So it sounds like you're encouraging people to be proactive, to go and try and find reasons for other people to fight you, rather than just going into their space and seeing what happens.
Yeah, and I think that's key, because I think what makes EVE great is your ability to use other people's assets and stuff as leverage. I think that's very important, because if someone just fights you because they want to, they're not that invested in it. It's sort of just like, you know, everyone hates Fight Club fights, and I think it's for a reason, because the whole point of EVE is that you're invested and you have something to lose, and it's painful if you lose. And I think the more we take that away, I think the more we lose what EVE is all about. And I think that's one of the problems that people are seeing with the game right now, is that we're slowly losing that. Because, you know, with and there are great things about Citadels, don't get me wrong, but with the introduction of all these ways that basically people can avoid fighting and avoid putting anything at risk, you know, it does help casual players on the one hand, but on the other hand, you do lose part of what EVE is about, you know, and you can't put as much pressure on people. And I think that's key in terms of FCing and getting great fights, is they have to feel pressure to fight you, and ideally to fight you in a hurry, so that they have to form up quickly. And so you kind of trade it, you know, there's advantage and disadvantages. You only have so many people that you've brought to their space. You can't get any more. You're in what you're in. That's your disadvantage. Your advantage is that you're ready to go. You know, their advantage is they're on their home turf, but their disadvantage is they have to form up quickly. They don't have time to sit there and make sure they have 15 T2 Logi or whatever. You know, they have to fight you now, or they're going to lose something painful. And so I think work walls are the only place that remains, really. So, and I think I would encourage people, exploit it. It's really not as hard to kill a work wall as you think if you have plenty of newts. You don't need as many numbers. You know, bring a doctrine that can fight another doctrine and like see what happens. I think I've had some great fights with CO2, you know, in the drone regions, you know, where you tackle a work wall and people show up to save it, and you just have this amazing fight. And so I think that's great.
Wrapping around to what we talked about earlier with creativity, what doctrine are you going to be talking about today?
So I think I'll be talking about the worms that I really like to use today. They're sort of a overpropped worm, and they're pretty unusual in that way. And I think you don't really see too many worms outside of low sec plexes and stuff, so people aren't as familiar with exactly what they do. Now, obviously, almost any FC nowadays will have an encyclopedic knowledge of just about every ship and what the bonuses are, and you know, some possible fits and stuff like that. But the worm, you know, the way that I like to fit it and the way that I like to fly it is somewhat unique. And if people aren't expecting it, it can really take them by surprise. And that's the part that I really like the most about it.
And from what I understand, this is a doctrine of your own invention, right?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's really hard in EVE because it's been going on for so long to say that, you know, you invented anything. I think that's really difficult, but I can't find anyone else who's run it before I did. I have actually seen Darkness running it recently, which made me a little bit happy, and also made me want to kill them because I didn't want them to use it, because it's a pretty good doctrine in my opinion. But I sort of came up with it, oh gosh, probably, I think when Horde was invading the north in World War B, maybe a little bit before that. And it's a Tenement worm doctrine. You have some, you know, overpropped logi with it. I usually FC from a Tenement Curies. As I said, my weakness is that I feel like I need to have a point. It does help me in some ways as an FC, because I can like recognize an enemy FC who's like 60k out, and instead of like waiting and broadcasting him and hoping someone's going to point him, I can just do it myself, and I know that he's not going anywhere. But I usually FC from the Tenement carries, and then we have like some links, Bifrost and stuff. Before they changed the links, I used to have just a link salt that I'd run around with instead and follow me around, which I'm glad those days are gone because that was terrible. And I always play on a small laptop, so dual boxing that, I'd forget it on gates all the time and stuff. But basically, it relies on speed and signature tanking. So the whole point of an overprop for those, and what it is, sort of for those people who don't know what I'm talking about, which maybe a lot of newer FCs don't, is it's basically putting a cruiser-sized afterburner on a frigate. And there's some trade-off here. It takes a ton of power grid, usually takes a lot of cap, and you have the terrible agility, absolutely terrible agility. It takes you forever to speed up and slow down. In exchange, you get basically the speed of a micro warp drive, a little bit less maybe, combined with the signature of an afterburner, so no signature increase at all. And since you're a frigate, you have a pretty small, pretty small signature as it is. So you can basically run around, and if people don't have a lot of webs and stuff, they will not hit you almost at all. Now, the other thing that's key about the Doctrine is that you're using Worms, which is a drone ship. And the reason this is really important is that if you're using almost anything else that's not a missile ship, you will out-track yourself, meaning they won't hit you, but you won't hit them either, because the better your transversal velocity and the less damage you're taking from them, the less damage you're going to do to them as well. So that's why it's key that it has to be a drone ship. That's what makes the Worm perfect. You also want a decent amount of DPS. There's a lot of factors that drive the Worm to be the best ship for this. You want a decent amount of DPS, and the nice thing about the Worm is because it only uses 2 drones, and you have a maximum of 50 that you can control at any one time as an FC if people assign their drones to you. The 2 drones are basically equivalent to 5 drones, maybe a bit more, of any other ship. So basically you have, you can have 25 ships of drones on you, which is incredible. And if you aggress on anyone, all those drones will go and kill them at the exact same time. And the volley is quite impressive. Now, this is not a novel idea, and I really came up with it. I can't take all the credit for it because I came up with it after talking to Lumpy about their 100 MN Gilas. And I was like, I wonder if you could do this on a Worm, and it turns out you could. So I found that fascinating. And I mainly used it and have used it. I still have this Doctrine. I've mainly used it to fight, cruiser and below size gangs. And especially what it's especially strong against is stuff like, back when Confessor gangs used to be all the rage, or Svipples, because, they'll happily fight you because they see a bunch of frigates. They don't necessarily know how they're fit. And, Svipples and Confessors typically eat frigates for breakfast. But the thing is, when you're orbiting out, at their radio range or their Aurora range or whatever, their tracking is not that good if they're using Aurora. And so they're not going to hit you. You can kind of stay out of their web range, and you can volley their deacons, like literally, or whatever logi they have. You can just one-shot them. And so basically, it's like they don't have any logi in that sense. And you can just kill all their logi and then just keep killing them until they leave, or you kill them all. And so, but a lot of them will just be so surprised because they'll be so confused why they're not killing you. And that's one of the things that I refer to as how I'm not a very good FC. So I kind of have to make people fight me when they really shouldn't be fighting me, but they don't know that, obviously. So this is sort of, really an exemplar of that in terms of the Worms, because people will think that they have the advantage on you, and they just don't know exactly what your ship is capable of doing. So,
what support do you use to achieve that goal? It seems like you have a very set game plan in that you want to kill logistics and then start to kill their DPS once they're out of them. Why do you choose the Bifrost, for example? Why do you choose the Kerries? Why not use, for example, a Morlos Navy issue or what's the Caldari Command Destroyer?
The Stork.
That's the one.
So I use the Bifrost mostly because it's has a tiny sig radius. It's very fast, and it has a great amount of agility. And so, I prefer it over the Stork for that reason. And it also has, I think, the low slots to be able to fit the micro auxiliary power cores that you need. It's been a while since I've gone over the fittings. I just have them saved, but that's why I remember choosing the Bifrost. Now, the reason for the Kerries is that it gets that really long point range, and I don't even use a faction point, although I suppose I could, because the drone control range of the Worms is like 70-something kilometers because I put a drone link augmenter on them, although I've recently switched the fit a little bit, but it's still, they have about a 70-kilometer drone range, I think, a bit more if you have good skills. So the point does have its use because you can basically fight from 0 kilometers if you want to, which there's some validity. If they don't have any webs, you get really close and they just cannot hit you at all. Or you can fight at max range and sort of outrange people. But either way, the point range of the carries is fantastic, especially with links. And so the Maulus Navy Shoot doesn't have a great scram, but as I remember, it doesn't get a point range bonus. And the carries also has decent resists and stuff that you want as an FC, especially those Galente T2 resists, which helps you survive getting headshot by your main weakness, which is actually cormorants, which I shouldn't be telling people, but most people could probably figure that out. But cormorants are the main thing that you're afraid of with this fleet. It's like really the only thing under cruiser size that I really don't like fighting.
Just as a quick aside here, you talk about using carries because it's a perfect FC ship for you. There's been talk previously about a dedicated FC ship. Do you think that there should be dedicated FC ships for frigate gangs and cruiser gangs as well as perhaps battle cruisers and battleships?
So I'm a bit conflicted on that, just because I think that they sort of already exist. Now they're not perfect because they're tank, while nice for frigate and cruiser size. So for example, you can get a really respectable tank on a Jackdaw, which I think Kendar uses all the time for his MOA fleets, or even a Stork if you fit it really nicely. But that said, I think they already exist to some extent because I think in the context of what you're fighting. So if you're fighting a frigate gang or a destroyer size gang and you have a Jackdaw with I think you can get like 40 or 50k HP or something crazy like that, maybe more. That's a lot, and so that's, I think, more or less enough. And you do have to sort of, to get that fit, usually do have to give up quite a lot. I don't think you usually do a lot of DPS. Not that you're worried about that as an FC anyway, but so I do think they sort of exist in some ways. I think the problem is sort of exclusive to battleships and maybe higher tier doctrines, because at that tier, that's when you start to get the insane amounts of alpha that you just don't see anywhere else. And I think that's why it's more critical for that. But I think on a smaller scale, it's not as big of a deal, especially because there's more sig tanking in play and so on and so forth. You don't have a dedicated enemy wing necessarily always that has tons of webs and stuff to keep you tackled as you might in a big set piece battle or something. So I think it's probably less necessary. On a side note, I did actually used to FC back before CCP nerfed the Swipple. I used to run large shield extender Swipples, which I think a lot of people don't know used to be possible. And so all of our Swipples would have 60 or 55k EHP, and I used to FC from a special FC one that had like 70k. So I don't think that's possible to do anymore since CCP changed it, but there did actually used to be a ridiculously tanky Swipple FC fit.
All right, very interesting. Let's get away a little bit from FCing. What's something an individual, a line member, can do to contribute to the success of this doctrine?
So that's the challenging part, because by its very nature, this fleet is not terribly interesting for your average worm pilot, which is unfortunate. But it's also part of what makes it so effective, because you delegate your drones and then they just volley things. So actually, we had this problem where people loved the sort of victories that they would get from the worm fleet, but they hated flying in them because the worms were so boring. But I sort of did find a remedy. So, and it's actually interesting because it had to do with fitting. So the original worm fit that I came up with, I just had this idea and I came up with a fit quickly. I didn't optimize it or anything, and we just used it for a long time. And basically the problem was you had 4 mid slots, and for the last mid slot, you had so little CPU. The only thing you could put there was a sensor booster, which was pointless because, you're not locking anything anyway. Eventually, someone smarter than I was found out that there's a drone rig, a Tech 2 drone rig, that gives you as much range as a drone link augmenter for way less fitting cost, obviously. Essentially no fitting cost. So we took the drone link augmenter off, we changed the rigs, had about the same tank, and now everyone had an E-War mod, which made things far more interesting for them. And so basically now the worm pilots can do their best job by finding, by using their E-War mid slot to basically, mess with enemy DPS, because you're not usually worried about Logi, or in the case of fighting a bigger doctrine with maybe T2 Logi, not that that happens all the time, but they could, shut down enough Logi that we could break them. So that's sort of where that comes into play now. The other thing that someone can do if they want to take some initiative, is fly a Dictor in these fleets, because I'm usually flying one of the only long-range tackle ships in this fleet, and it's hard. As soon as people start losing, they can usually leave, and so the Dictors have a tough job because they're the only things that are vulnerable to being killed. Like, everything else has an overprop afterburner and is very hard to actually kill. But the Dictors obviously are MWD fit and have to be a lot closer to the enemy, and it's a lot harder to do that. So that's probably where an individual's sort of initiative and skill would come into it, is flying a Dictor in a worm fleet. It's very hard.
So let's talk about ranges with regards to these worms. How far can they fire out to? And, where do you want to be in the fight? Do you want to be right in close to them, or do you want to try and stick at, the edge of drone control range?
It kind of depends on what you're fighting. So, for example, there used to be these T1 cruiser fleets that would come to Horde space all the time, and I would always basically be, maybe 20k away from them. It was enough range that we could keep our speed up, because you have such terrible agility that if you're literally on top of them, you won't be able to keep your speed up. And they usually didn't have too many webs, so that was okay to be at that range. Anything, where they have webs, obviously you want to take it out first, unless it's something that you can't kill. So Hugens are like the death of this doctrine. Like, you cannot fight anything basically with Hugens. Hyenas you can one-shot, so it's fine. Vigil fleet issues, whatever, any smaller webs are fine, but Hugens are really where you draw the line. But I think maybe a case where you want to stay at longer range, at 70 or something, which is basically the max range of the doctrine, is maybe anytime they have a lot of newts, because you're kind of on the edge of cap stability with your 10 men. If anybody newts you, that person will probably cap out and fall behind, and that's bad for them. Anytime so cormorants are actually really interesting, and cormorants are what I form when Darkness started bringing these worms down, because they're so cheap. You can lose a ton of them and kill a few worms, and it's like totally fine. They track amazingly. They have insane range, so you just basically sit there and trade with the worms as best as you can, and it's very challenging. I fought corms a couple times, and a few times we've won against them, and it involves usually sitting at sort of mid to long range so that they're forced to use spike, but also being like close enough that you can keep up transversal. It's a very hard thing to pull off. If you go too close, they use like antimatter, and they get no tracking penalty, and they will just shred you. If you go too long, your transversal basically isn't enough, and the spike will track you. So it's like this very awkward sort of like 50k, I think, about maybe like 60. Sometimes a bit farther, depending on what their fit is, but it's very hard to fight cormorants, and so that's where range is a real challenge. And more often than not, I just won't, because it's like you'll lose so much stuff to kill a few cormorants, and then they just reship and do it again. So I really hate fighting cormorants with the worms. That's really the only thing that is the bane of them. But that's where the range control is the most challenging. But most of the time, you want to be closer rather than farther, just so that you can keep your Dictors alive with your Logi, so that you can point everything you need to point, so that the worms have a very small lock range. For example, they only have like 38k lock range, so if you want to use your E-War, you basically have to be close. And if they don't have a lot of webs, being close really isn't a problem. The only time when it actually was a big problem is, I think we were fighting some CO2 ruptures, like 50 ruptures or something, and their guns were not doing anything, but they had so many light drones that I actually ended up having to move us out of the drone range, because we were losing people to all these light drones. We just couldn't hold reps against 50 sets of light drones.
So given how important transversal is to this doctrine, how do you engage with it? Because obviously trying to go into someone is going to mean that you start the whole fight stopped. Do you ever find that a challenge? And how do you normally try and set up your fights to give yourself the most advantage?
It is quite challenging. I think the first 10 seconds of the fight are the hardest, because unless you're already set up and they jump into you, which is rare, that's when everyone's speeding up and you don't have all the advantages that you need yet. So you can lose quite a few people in these first few seconds. Usually what I'll do is, if someone's farther away, I'll go in them at an angle, and we'll usually take some damage doing that, but it usually equalizes and goes fairly quickly. And one of the things that I do to try to mitigate this is that, first of all, if we're sitting at range, I'll point the enemy FC, which is a little gay, but I guess, but it means that they won't leave, and I can sort of push the advantage. And then I also have the scalpels or the Kirans. We've sort of gone back and forth on which are better. But the scalpels do have a tiny sig. I actually, instead of having them, have most people keep at range on me in the Curies, I actually will have the scalpels orbit. And so pretty much no matter what direction we're going, they will have, and they're actually quite a bit faster than the rest of the fleet, so that's why they can get away with that. They will have some sort of transversal pretty much all the time. So that does mitigate it a little bit. But you're right, that's the challenge. If it's anything with like medium-sized guns or bigger, usually as long as you're within 50k going at like a 30 or 45 degree angle, you'll be fine. It's really when it's smaller stuff that it's more scary.
So you talked right at the start of this. You talked about how you have your little sig and your Vanguard sig, and they're 20 to 25 people, and obviously that is a lot smaller than all the surrounding entities. So do you think that these worms fight well outnumbered?
Yes, they fight very well outnumbered. I should say that most of my worm fleets have actually been maybe a couple months ago when I was still in Spaceship Samurai or with Horde at large in them. I have run them with Vanguard a few times, but generally these are something I run with Horde at large because actually the skills to get into a worm are pretty minimal. And we always need more. Yeah, we actually have bursts for newbies and stuff like that as well. So it's actually a surprisingly fairly friendly doctrine. But it fights very well outnumbered because as long as they cannot kill you, which any reasonable fight that you'll take in these, I mean, the margin for error is basically zero. Like if they can hit you, you'll die because your EHP is not that much. It's like 10k, I think, in a worm or something, less in a scalpel. So I mean, if they have any webs, essentially, it's basically you can't take the fight unless you're able to take them out very quickly. But any fight that you can take, I mean, you can sort of stick around and try things for as long as you want, and you will not really lose ships. So you can go for this logi and then that logi and then try, this ship, and you can sort of just probe their defenses until something dies or a logi dies, and then you have this cascading effect. And actually a full worm trigger, so like 25 worms, which I usually go out with maybe 20 to 25 actual worms. That's pretty scary. Like it can volley a scythe pretty much, or an osprey, 1 to 2 shots, and the rate of fire is so quick, and the drones move so quick, and you can just, because you're controlling all the drones, you can cycle between targets just incredibly quickly. It's very stressful for hostile logi, and so you can break them very, very easily. And I should say, by the way, that people hate fighting this doctrine once they've tried it a few times. Like they just won't do it a lot of the times. But as long as you've got some transversal up and you're orbiting and they don't have any webs, like I mean, you can stay there forever and they just won't be able to do anything to you. And so the time is really on your side in that way.
Okay, so are there any tips or tricks that people have used against the doctrine other than just flying cormorants and having a bunch of webs that you found that were either very interesting or effective?
Yeah, so they're pretty vulnerable to bombs because their agility is so bad, and actually a void bomb will really mess your day up, like your entire fleet, because you're all in the same spot. And it's just terrible. And really, like neuting the FC. So when I get neuted, everyone slows down, and we don't have any cap transfers in our fleet, right? So I'm like really out of luck if that happens. Then we have to find a new anchor, and of course, the agility is terrible. So by the time we found a new anchor or something, which it doesn't happen that often, which is why I don't set up a new anchor every time. It's pretty rare actually, but it causes total chaos. Everyone slows down, goes all over the place. Headshotting can be fairly effective. Going after the logi with light drones actually. So the scalpels are really thin. Now they're very hard to track, but light drones don't really have a problem. And so when they kill the scalpels, it's pretty easy. And once you lose your logi, you're really in trouble in this fleet. So stuff like that, the weak spot really is the logi, and that's why I've considered switching to the Kirin quite a bit. We've sort of gone back and forth on that because it does have quite a bit. It's a little bigger, but it has far more tank than the scalpel does. And the scalpel is just, I mean, their EHP is nothing essentially. So stuff like that, causing pandemonium, causing the fleet to slow down. Even if you only have one web in your fleet, like if you web the FC or the anchor, and just everyone slows down, it takes a long time for them to speed back up, and you can kill a lot of stuff in that time. So void bombs, neuting, messing with an enemy anchor, and killing scalpels are probably the easiest thing to do. Smart bombs, surprisingly, are not very effective, and people try it a lot. And actually, so they're somewhat more effective than they are on Gilas, but I'll explain sort of something that's a little counterintuitive. So I also fly Gilas quite a bit, which is essentially the same thing, but just bigger. Same idea in just about every way. And I will, you'll be fighting battle cruisers, for example, Feroxes or something, and they'll try to smart bomb your drones off. But your drones have so much HP, actually, that by the time they've smart bombed your drones, you launch a new set and they're all like low, not necessarily zero, but like they're a lot lower in their shield, and so they're much easier to kill now with a second wave of drones. And if they keep smart bombing, they will just keep losing HP. So same with the worm drones. They're actually really tanky, and anything you're fighting is usually smaller, so they usually don't have large smart bombs, and they have less HP. So they actually usually end up hurting themselves more if they use smart bombs. So that's actually something that I would not recommend using to counter it, and people try that all the time. It just doesn't work.
All right. Well, I would normally ask you directly about all the weaknesses and all the strengths of the doctrine, but I think you've really covered the vast majority of it without any prompting. So thank you for making my life a little easier.
Yeah, no problem. That's probably stupid of me, because now, people are gonna sort of know, whoever listens. Most probably, higher tier FCs will have some idea, once they see the velocity or something, what's going on. But I probably am hurting myself by giving away some of the lesser known secrets of the doctrine. But that's okay. I think it's important that people know about sort of the other options than just flying like AHAX or MAX or something.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your time. I hope to one day see you on the field, because I don't think I've ever actually fought you.
Yeah, I don't think so. I try not to go to Providence too much. It's actually a dangerous region. Like, it's easy to get stuck.
So
but yeah.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, yeah, it was great being on the show. I really appreciate it. But,
yeah. Do you have any shout-outs?
I just want to say, obviously, I have to shout out the Godfather, or he'll punish me later. And shout out to Robert Augustus, who's a fantastic Victor pilot who always makes my life a lot easier. So.
All right. Well, once again, thank you very much for your time, and fly smart, everybody.